Muy bien, pues ahora sí que
Very
demos
well.
inicio a...
So let's get started with our session today. Welcome, all of you. We have today our workshop on good regulatory practices and international trade in Chile. And we have some messages for the event to work well for everyone. So as you know, the session will be recorded for later publication in the website together with the presentations we are going to have over the 2 days. We have simultaneous translation to Spanish and English. So you can just click the globe and choose your channel. The microphones are all muted, so we don't have any background noises during the presentations. And we want the sessions to be interactive so we can build knowledge together. So we would thank you to add all your questions in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And when you are participating on the Q&A session, you can open your cameras because it helps the work of the interpreters. And without any further ado, let me share the agenda for the day. And as you have seen in the invitations, we are going to start mentioning what is the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergency for the medical technology sector and an overview of the good regulatory practices and together with Renata Amaral. And we are going to talk about the good regulatory practices in Chile, a session that we are going to have Camila Carrasco and Maria Fernanda Campos. And finally, we are going to conclude the session with the participation of Stephen Pipes of AdvaMed, talking about the role of the industry in the processes of good regulatory practices. And so with that, we start by sharing what is the coalition. It has the purpose of strengthening the regulatory convergency and the regulatory convergence in the level of the whole American continent. Currently, we have representatives as members of the coalition in 10 countries through 17 associations and chambers, with association of 6 developing organizations like ISO, IEC, and others. And within the main components of the coalition, we have the vision of being able to have one standard, one test accepted for all the scope of the medical technology. We think it's important because we can collaborate and speed up the regulatory processes that are needed so we can have safe and accessible products for the patient care. Regarding our mission, our focus is on being able to get regulation standards and requirements to evaluate the conformity of medical devices and technology in international level. So the coalition has the technical secretariat with the people you see on the screen, and also for governance, we have an executive committee that is renewed every 2 years through a voting system of all the members of the coalition. The coalition was funded in March last year, so the members of the executive committee will be in function until March next year, and we have representatives for that period in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Argentina, and also the 2 national alliances being part of this committee, as Aladiv and Alimed. And also we had AdvaMed, and these are the first permanent members of the executive committee. And within the activities we perform as a coalition, one of the most important is the development of resources so they are available for the members of the coalition to make their day-to-day work easier. So this is one of the tasks we had. The first one was the construction of a website where we could consolidate all the knowledge we understand are so important to facilitate the lives of all the players that are relevant for our sector. You can have access to the presentation where you have the link for the website, which is available in English and Spanish. And all the materials we have developed, we put in these two languages, and in most cases also in Portuguese, because we know that the language can be an important barrier to advance in this path towards regulatory convergence. So on the website, you have spaces where we emphasize international standardization, with the spaces to talk about international standards, the international references, and particularly what has to do with the guidelines the World Health Organization produces and the global model of regulatory framework for medical devices and IVDs, and the documents that were recently published regarding good regulatory practices and reliance practices, and also the documents that are published and issued by IMDRF. In terms of good regulatory practice, we have work related to the obligations that countries have when they are part of the IPEC, OECD, the World WTC, and also the TBT, and the bilateral agreements. And an important component as well, a session that we have in the website, has to do with transparency and trade. We have a very broad session regarding the building of capacities, where we have our trainings developed for the members of the coalition, when we start with the key points of good regulatory practice in global level, and we have developed some specific ones for Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, and this one now for Chile. We also have had sessions with organizations, and then we have some programs of auditing for ISO 13485, where we have FDA and FISA and MET participating, and another one that is one for FDA with their regulatory model. And finally, we have a session talking about the documents regarding the positioning we have as a coalition, which has institutional relation with other institutions in a way that we can collaborate and generate some positions that don't have just a regional reach, but also a global reach, and we are all aligned in the same way. In terms of building capacities, in this slide, you have the links for all the different kinds of trainings, and you can have access directly from the website. But because you have access through this presentation, it may be easier to use those tools for those who are interested in them. And now about future events. We have this one that is taking place today and tomorrow for Chile. For Mexico, we are developing a series of sessions, 4 sessions regarding good regulatory practices, and also it will start tomorrow. And in the slide, you're going to have all the information you can need for participating. And with the session with the regulators, we have the sessions that have happened already, and that are 2 ones that will be starting as of November. So we have 2 series, one having to do with the single identification systems with the FDA, and the one that has to do with international standards and compliance evaluation. Regarding the documents in terms of positioning, we have the first one developed that has to do with the law of pharmaceutical products, number 2, and the one for Ecuador related to the education in terms of traceability. As I was saying, it's key for us to remove the language barriers. So we have used the translation of the laws and good regulatory practices in these 4 key topics. They are not official translations, but they are available, and they make it easier to help you with this work. And so these three documents are also translated into Portuguese. So they are all available and accessible on our website. As you see, our role has to do with the development of capacities of all the players involved in the sector, and they collaborate with the sector from government initiatives, private initiatives, the academy, international and national levels, because we believe the interactive collaboration of all the players have to do with ensuring the patients have the required and adequate safe products for their healthcare. And with that, I finished the introduction about the coalition. If you have any questions, please let me know.
Muy bien. Perdón.
Creo que hay una pregunta en el
I believe there is a question in the Q&A session. So the question is about where to find all the material, the consult material. Well, it's all available on the coalition website. And on the presentation, you have all the links, so you can access all the documentations, and all the presentations will be available on the website in the training session about regulatory policies. But we are going to put on the chat the link so you can access it right away. Without any more questions, so I'm going to call Renata. Renata, the floor is yours. Good morning to everyone. Let me just share my screen. So as Sandra has mentioned, our work is very focused on good regulatory practices and the regulatory convergence. So I'm going to introduce the topic, the technical topic for those 2 days. And so we are going to talk a lot from people, and we are going to hear from people from the government in Chile, the World Health Organization. And so let me just give an overview of the topic for the 2 days in a quick presentation, and I'll leave some space for the questions at the end as well. So I work basically with international trade and good regulatory practices in the coalition. I've been working since the beginning of the coalition with Centralia and Leticia and all the others from the technical secretariat group. And so what are the good regulatory practices? Basically, the term good regulatory practices is very important. It's first explanation. It's not about creating more or less regulation, but the quality and the consistency of the process nationally. So it has to do with the coordination, the internal coordination and the review process where the government works to ensure the rules and regulations are developed openly, with transparency and with the participation of all the stakeholders. And so we have the results based on risks and the best data available. So all the agencies and bodies that are regulating bodies in the government, they work with the coordination of this review of the rules that are created in a national space. We are not here talking about international level yet. So good regulatory practices is an internal process of the countries.
Las buenas prácticas regulatórias, entonces no se
The
trata
good regulatory practices, so they're not more regulation or less regulation, but they want to achieve best regulatory results in several topics that we have and where we can apply good regulatory practices in a national level. The policies have regional decisions, but good regulatory practices create professional processes to create rules that follow policies that are already established. So they are able to do that with a process that creates transparent and with participation, so transparent policies. And I'm talking about public consultation. This is something that we know very well, As regulators, I'm sure we have a lot of people that are part of the regulatory process in Chile, just like many of us this morning. So it is a transparent process, and it should include the participation of stakeholders, and decision-making should be evidence-based. Good practices are an important predecessor of regulatory cooperation. So we have internal good regulatory practices to be prepared for an international cooperation process of regulatory cooperation, I mean. These quality results can only be beneficial if we enjoy the opportunities of regulatory cooperation. And I will talk a little bit more about that. As you know, the number of the coalition has regulatory convergency in its name. However, there is a difference between regulatory cooperation and regulatory convergency. When I'm talking about cooperation and convergency, what they have in common is that they are processes where we are considering the international scope. So regulatory cooperation is any interaction between regulators of different countries that somehow creates cooperation, aiming to increase efficiency, the time in which these regulatory results are reached. So cooperation is, for example, when two countries start talking a little bit, exchange information about its internal regulations, and not necessarily focusing on creating a convergency or the same regulation, but it's just for cooperation between the countries to avoid, for example, the creation of new regulations that are going to finally impact international trade. I will talk more about that. So cooperation is a process where we have conversation between countries in which we try to get to a final alignment of the regulations, internal regulations. And convergency is a step further than cooperation. So convergency is a form of cooperation. So in this case, different countries also want to change their regulatory frameworks that already exist, and they want to get to a closer convergency, a closer connection. So convergency can happen throughout a long time. And then in the future, we finally get to convergency if we start with the cooperation. But at the moment, when you're creating the regulations in the specific countries, they are independent between themselves and it's hard to synchronize. So my entire presentation, as you'll see, is very much considering the regulatory part connected to the international trade. As we know, the entire production chain of medical devices is huge. It goes through many countries usually. So the least amount of regulatory obstacles we can have, and the more aligned the regulatory convergency can be, that is better for the flow of merchandise and products between countries. The regulatory process and how it works. We have a life cycle of regulations. So, of course, this is a life cycle in general. We have a lot of different steps here that can be in between these 5 steps that we have signaled in this presentation, which is basically identifying the need and finding goals for a new regulation, for example, getting data and comments for interest parties, designing the regulation itself, applying the regulation, and evaluating the regulatory impact. So that is the basic life cycle of creating a new regulation. The regulatory cooperation can happen during any of these steps. So during the design, during the monitoring, observing, or management, ex post management of the regulation. So it's very hard, it's very difficult for the regulatory cooperation to succeed without applying good internal regulatory practices. Of course, it's difficult. If I'm going to talk in my country, it's Brazil, for example, talking about Brazil, let's say we don't have a process of good regulatory practices installed and in place. And in my national territory, it's difficult for me to cooperate with Chile that maybe has a much better regulatory process. How are we going to cooperate internationally if our internal process is not yet well organized and the good regulatory practices are not well established? So starting from the international scope to think of the internal scope, to think of maybe, to get to a convergency as well, this is especially important for this sector because we know, as I already said, these are production chains that go through many countries. It's a very globalized sector. So the more we are able to cooperate internally with good regulatory practices in each country, that is going to be better for the international cooperation of rules and merchandise flow. So the implementation of good regulatory practices is a significant step towards cooperation, since regulations that are well designed are going to create results that will generate less challenges. So key components of the good regulatory practices. We have also designed a basic process of key components that should be in the entire good regulatory practices process. Probably you guys will already hear some of these in more detail on the presentations we will have today and tomorrow. But what are the key components? Transparency and participation of all major stakeholders, thinking of public consultation, for example. Qualitative data and solid science. Focus based in risk. Evaluation of regulatory impact, and I will talk about this one a little bit more in the next slide, the specific component. Analysis favoring competence. The international impact of a rule. The function of norms and evaluation of conformity, ex-post evaluation, and central coordination of good regulatory practices in a national environment. So this is the model with key components that we would like to see in all countries that we are working with. I want to talk a little bit more about the evaluation of the regulatory impact, because it is an extremely important part of the process. And I'm sure that you will hear more about this in this workshop. So the good regulatory practices will anticipate the impact it will have in the market. So here we are considering an evaluation, an impact evaluation towards the market. So this is a new regulation in the market. They project the benefits and especially the economic benefits of a specific regulation. That one specific regulation will have in the costs of the market. The good regulatory practices will guide the efforts of regulators to better calculate costs and benefits according to the creation of guides and the development of a common methodology that is used among regulatory authorities. So as I've been saying since the beginning of my presentation, the good regulatory practices with which we're working, and we are actually trying to create a process that is a together reconnaissance project with all the countries that we work with. The good regulatory practices at a national level, we are considering a internal coordination between all regulatory agencies at national and all countries. So that's why we have been doing this work, and we've been doing specific workshops as well for each country, considering the problems or specific solutions that each country may have among the countries that we're working with. Renata, I'm sorry. Could you talk a little bit slower and pause a little bit before you go to the next slide? Because we're asking a little bit more time for the interpreters and the audience as well that are participating in English. Thank you. I'm worried about the time, so we don't have a lot of problems. No problem. I'll speak a little bit slower. Can I go after this one? I think so, right? Yes, sure. So the interface between good regulatory practices and international trade. So here we start talking a little bit more about the topic that we have the most interest in the coalition, which is having exactly the connection between regulators and negotiators. For example, when we're talking about international trade. So we're actually really trying to bring all these stakeholders in a common place to talk about these topics together. So because one has significant impact on the other. In the last couple of years, we've paid attention to the growth of commercial costs related to regulatory divergencies. And actually, regulatory divergencies can raise costs of goods and services between borders. So something that is very common for experts in international trade, for example, is saying and following actually. And the specific goals for taxes for commerce are smaller, while the technical obstacles for commerce are, most important. So here we have a chart of the World Trade Organization, so you can see it. World Trade Organization was created in 1995. From 1995 until 2021, look how many new notifications only in the technical barriers to trade agreement. This is in English here, technical barriers to trade. So you can see here the number of notifications and its growth for technical barriers to trade. This chart is also repeated for sanitary and phytosanitary obstacles. And also, when we're talking about both types of obstacles, technical barriers, as well as sanitary and phytosanitary, they are clearly the leaders in notification when we're talking about the World Trade Organization. And when I say notifications, I'm actually talking about notification of new regulations, but I'm also talking about notification of members, maybe new complaints. They're complaining about new obstacles that were created in the technical side and not the tariff side. So from 1995 to today, the tariff barriers, the tariff obstacles, they have been following a trade of being reduced, and the technical barriers have grown significantly in the past years. That's why it is so important that we actually create these spaces and these workshops to talk about these topics with you, because the biggest problem that we have today in international trade are technical barriers and not tariff barriers.
Eu quero hablar un poco del acuerdo, ¿no? De obstáculos técnicos, muy brevemente, porque mañana ustedes van a tener una sesión con Devin McDaniels, que es que trabaja.
Sorry, we'll have a session on the International Trade Organization, and there will be a talk tomorrow in more details on how the notifications work in the TBT committee, in the World Trade Organization committee, and how you can work together with the WTO, because that's what we have been trying to do, how to work in a partnership with WTO, and they are very focused on the health sector. So we have many opportunities of collaboration and to understand how the organization works, how the access works to the organization via the Chilean government. So tomorrow we have a session with Dev and Gaston Fernandez from the Chilean government that work very close to WTO. So the landscape of the technical barriers to trade agreement So it works as a tool, an instrument with focus, of course, on the technical barriers to trade, but it works with an instrument to boost members to use less restrictive measures to trade, normalize the use of international standards that are relevant, also increase transparency and avoiding trade disputes related to the technical regulation or standards. So let's talk about the relevant standards. In medical device, you have many relevant standards and many forums Chile is a part of. So the idea here is where there are international standards that are harmonized for the sector, for a certain product or production chain, where there is international standard that is harmonized, that are relevant already, that it shouldn't be creating internal new standards. So you can use the existing standards without creating anything new, because at the end, it can end up being a barrier that is not necessary for trade. So the agreement works with that, with focus on where there are already standards, not to create new ones. I would like to quickly speak, just to conclude my presentation, of EPING and transparency. So we talk a lot about EPING. It's a system from WTO, that is open to public and private parties and the academia, and there is a system of warnings, and you can subscribe to receive via email the reviews that are on regulations regarding products or interesting markets. So the idea of EPING is when Chile is going to create a new regulation on a certain product, the idea is that Chile can communicate WTO. So there is time for a public consultation. So the other members of WTO, because WTO has 164 member countries, and so every time there is a new regulation, they can communicate the organization via EPING. So there is space for the other members of the organization to comment, to add or criticize the new regulation, raise an awareness or a warning on the regulation. So the whole information system works to the international stakeholders and other members of WTO and can help them address issues related to the future regulations as well. So it is an administration website dedicated to government officers that work with issues related to transparency in terms of sanitary and phytosanitary measures and also technical barriers to trade. And it's a web page everyone can access. So this is a print of the page where you have access to everything here. You can create an account. So you can see on the right, you can create your own account, and to have a query, you can search, you can create notifications, create filters, specific filters on specific members. You can choose to receive all notifications or only the ones related to sanitary and phytosanitary measures or just related to technical barriers to trade. You can choose the products, keywords, and maybe tomorrow we are going to hear more details about EPING and how it works. But I'm open to answer any questions you have about it as well. But this is a system we are really encouraging everyone to access, and you can also create warnings and notifications that get to your email with the filters you choose here in the system. Other available mechanisms in WTO, besides all that, of notifications to the WTO committees related to the technical barriers to trade, and when we are concerned about the rules of another member of WTO, for instance, Chile is worried about the new rule France has, we can present via Chilean government some questioning about this new regulation, so France can clear out in the committee of WTO how the regulation will work. And if it doesn't work, that are commercial and trade policy reviews in WTO. It happens every 2, 4, or 6 years, depending on the economic level and the size of the economy of the country. And there are also commercial disputes and ways to deal with them. This is the last instance, this is the last resource if there is some problem, some issues related to the technical barriers to trade or any other agreements in WTO. With that, I conclude my presentation. I was worried about the times, that's why I spoke so fast, but I believe it was all right. Thank you, Renata. Thank you so much. I don't see any questions on the Q&A, or in the chat we were asked to add the EPING link. We have already put it there, so you can have them available. And on the coalition website, you have a list of all the codes, so you can use to receive the alerts related to the products we manage on the sector. So on the website, you have the list already ready for the codes, so you can receive all the notifications. I don't see any more questions. Renata, maybe one of those would be, what would be your recommendation so all the stakeholders in the sector may have, let's say, a more active role in terms of the generation of notifications to the WTO and to the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee? The practical recommendation is to work closer to the government, because the government is the ones that should present those notifications. But the government can't present something they don't know about. So the information comes from the private sector. And so my recommendation would be to understand the organization is something that is not so far from us. It is a tool we should use. Every time we have any problems, the public sector has problems, because sometimes they have problems that they don't know how to complain, how to address the issue, question these issues. So working together with the government and let the government know of the problems the private sector has, it helps them to work together and get to the WTO, if this is one of the solutions for any specific case. But really, that's it. Let the government know of the issues the private sector has. Otherwise, the government can't help you. Very well. And now we have some seconds more, and there is a question from Luisa Cifuentes. The percentage of regulation warnings you can receive are annually? Well, in the WTO website, you can have that information. I can find the link for you, but I'm sure Dave is going to talk about that tomorrow. So that's why I didn't approach that. He knows more about it because he talks on behalf of WTO. Thank you so much, Renata, for your presentation. And let's move on And now we have Camila Carrasco and Maria Fernanda Campos, who are part of the National Productivity and Entrepreneurship Office of the Ministry of Economy, Development and Tourism of Chile. And they're going to talk about specifically the good regulatory practice of Chile. So Camila and Maria Fernanda, the floor is yours. If you want, you may share your screen. Thank you, Sandra. Let me share my screen now. And please let me know if it's working. Yes, it is. Well, first of all, what I would like to do was to invite you because we like very much the good regulatory practice topic. So we created this workshop and we like to participate in this kind of forums because, as we said, as Renata said, the private sector is not an antagonist as well as an ally in the moment of regulation. So in general terms, in our office, let me tell you, I'm Camila Carrasco Donoso, and we have Fernanda Campos Parodi, which is a chief of the office. I'm the executive secretary of our National Productivity and Entrepreneurship Office. So let me tell you a little about the diagnosis. When we started working in the beginning of the current administration. So it was recommended to have a diagnosis on what was going on with our regulatory framework. And we understood that they are intrinsically related to what we have in the country. So it is a catalyzer of growth, or it can be a barrier, and it can provide extra risks to a country that is growing at a certain level and maybe regulation can stay behind. So the first instance, we saw that Chile was the country with most complexity in the regulatory procedures of OCDE. And so this report talks about the specific sector, but also the economy in general. So we see the level where the public policies promotes or inhibits market growth. And there is a specific session there about the intervention of the government. So we talk about the simplification evaluation of the regulations. And there is an aspect of how complex is your framework. So it opened our eyes to see that there was a problem there. And then we went to the Library of the National Congress to ask, even though there was not an official source for our framework, to ask how many laws, how many decrees there are and standards that are effective in the country at the moment. And the truth, the answer was that no one knew, no one counts that. And because we had an unofficial account, we ended up with this exercise for the first time, and we realized there were around 300,000 regulations that were effective and applicable. And we see there is a flow of growth. And so we have 9,000 new instruments a year. And so around 80, 90 laws that are published. And so we understood we had this context where we had a very huge stock and a huge flow, increasing more and more to the problem.
En el fondo, nos llamó la atención como,
And
bueno,
also, one thing that we saw is, well, is this a problem that we have in Chile? Is this a problem we have in Latin America? So to give you some context, we saw what is going on in Mexico. In Mexico, there's a bit over 110,000 regulations total, but we have only we have less people and less companies. So Chile, we had 300,000 regulation for a country that has less than 20 million people and almost 1 million people, companies, sorry. So if you wanted to see a regulation per capita, that was actually very good. It was too much. Another red flag we saw at the beginning is the office itself. So given that this came from the library, we ended up checking, what are we talking about when we're talking about these current regulations in Chile? And we were able to see that, for example, the laws in Chile, they have about 59 years old. They're about 59 years old. And there are over 1,000 laws that are from before the 1900s. So they are laws that have no meaning nowadays. They don't make sense, but they're still current. So some decrees were a little bit younger, like 17, 18 years old, but it's because there was a boom of creation of decrees in the last decade, and we'll be able to look at that in a graph in the next slides.
De ver qué está pasando en
So
Chile.
we continued checking what was going on in Chile, and we started seeing what is being done in each ministry. And as an initial attempt of getting a little bit of order and cleaning up the house, is that in 2016, there was a presidential decree that wanted a productivity inform, basically. We wanted to see what is the problem, what is the goal, and what is the alternative that is going to solve that problem. So we would send this to the ministries, the economy ministries, for example, and they had to have this type of informative report, but this was so broad and it would give the ministry ability to define if they wanted to do it or not, that basically we received, very few informative reports from 2016 until we began this other process in 2018. And to give you some context, the reality of each ministry is very uneven because what we had in the database of the Congress library, we saw that we have a lot of regulations and there are endless regulations. To give an example, the Ministry of Public Policies has over 52,000 laws in only one ministry. Transport, for example, we have 24,000 laws and decrees. Health Ministry, which is one that could maybe be interesting for you, we have 8,000 laws and decrees. So it's still a very high level for any person to be up to date with and with all the requirements and standards that they have. But we also had a challenge here of creating a plan that would be able to go through to the entire government and for the entire executive sectors, because some ministries had kind of this tendency to regulation. So the first option is also create regulation. And the same way we didn't have culture, like if this kind of instrument is useful. So we continued doing interviews and we didn't really know the existence and the need and instruction of regulatory impact that is there. And we would say, so what do you think? We would see like a bureaucratic requirement, and the first reaction was like, we already do our work well, don't question what we do, don't question our process of creating regulation. And they didn't see a point in actually creating this instrument. Well, I'm going a little bit, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. So we started thinking that Chile would have to be better in this aspect. And this is the result of the last report that we have. These are the indicators of regulatory policy and governance. This was a survey from 2017 and 2021. We have 2021 in the last column, and we have a comparison with what we had before that and what is kind of an average of the outcome. So as you can see, we improved in terms of what we had before, but we are still far from the best practices that we can see in other countries all over the world. So some of the big pillars we have is what are the stakeholders involved in this development process? So for laws as well as for decrees and other regulations that may be created. And how are we doing the regulatory impact analysis? And how many ex post evaluations are we doing on the regulations that we do create? So what did we do in practice? As I was saying, we got here and we had the presidential instructive. And this is what we had, which was the productivity informative reports, like I mentioned. Then we had the Chile report. So this evaluation report was going to account for failures and would recommend for us to strengthen institutionality and reviewing this inform, creating the methodology or methodologies that are already existing should follow international recommendations, so being a little bit more robust and continuing this process. And it says that we are going, we're going in the right path, but there's still a long way to go. In 2018, we created the Open. And for the first task, we sent something to the Congress, and this included that by law, they were going to have to do the productivity inform report, and all ministries would have to do it. And the problem, there is a strategy problem on our side, because one was miscellaneous that had 26 other measures of other types. And two, the second error was that initially we also sent it to the Congress to review a much more simple and unformatted inform report. And from that, we finished blocking and stopping this advancement. So it wasn't traumatized, but it didn't really move on. So in 2019, we had a great effort to gather all good international practices that we had to review and everything that was being done in Chile. And that way we had the Chilean Guide for Good Regulation. And that was kind of the first effort to bring something concrete and get the effort that we were doing as an office in something concrete. And it's a lot of information that was in fact useful for us and to tell the authorities that what we were doing was correct. And in the future, I can show you the principles that we have on this guideline. And lastly, in 2019, we had two presidential instructives. So in the first one, which is number 3, now we are saying that it is mandatory to all 24 ministries for them to do it's actually no longer a productivity inform report, but it's the regulatory impact report. So this one has more reach, and also we want to have the standard methodology of good practices applied. So this started being current in July 2019, and all ministries have to do that for laws and decrees. And currently, 2 years after we had this instruction being current and valid, we did a survey on the platform, and we have been strengthening the publicity of this instruction and the entire internal part of realization, and this is being improved. And we hope that this year we are going to be able to publish a new version of this instruction. As I was saying here, if you want to scan this QR code and see this in more detail, feel free to do that. But as I mentioned, what we did is following these standard regulatory policies that are the best, and they are followed by all countries. And here we have these 5 pillars. And firstly, all regulators need to consider these pillars. In our opinion, they're all kind of common sense. So if you're able to read them clearly, these are topics that need to be considered. But the sad thing is that in practice, this wasn't being applied. I'm going to give you an example. When we started with the ministry capacitations, we would say, well, basically, you need to write something very short, say what's the problem, what's the goal, and which alternative you analyze to get to your final solution. And some reacted like, why do I have to do that if I don't have to do it? And at the end, they're going to create new regulation that is going to bring them more cost to enforce. Some regulator or agent is going to have to enforce it. And we try to limit the problem, the goal, and analyzing alternatives. So that's what we require. So it was kind of establishing what is the least amount of things you have to do, thinking of the design and regulation. What we also found in terms of diagnosis is that in general, in Chile, and I imagine in several Latin American countries go through the same, is that just the regulation, because of regulation. Is there a problem? Create regulation. Something is not working, create regulation. So the regulators are trying to think that they have to regulate everything. And deep down, they have the good intention of believing that regulation is the best solution to the problem. But we do have alternatives, and it could be non-regulatory, of course. But this, deep down, is very difficult to break. If the regulator comes and, they go all the way to the end, and then we go and write regulation anyway. And this would be kind of reinforced because Chile is a legalist country. So the same industry sometimes likes to have everything written down, that the standard and the law and regulation to be written down and for it to exist physically. And of course, we have this is important because of fiscalization. And instead of having something, it's not a cultural that you trust other people, instead of doing that, following principles, we have a context of self-regulation and self-awareness. So I would rather have you list the requirements, and I'm going to comply with them one by one and more because I want to be 100% in compliance with the law. So we are in that middle ground in terms of change. That way, our first deliverable concrete product was creating this platform, which is an online platform where all ministries, 24 ministries, they have access, they have a user, so the high directors as well as technical workers. And in this platform, we have a standardized form, which is simple to populate, and it is just an inform report for all ministries. And the ministry is like the heart of the government. And deep down, there are regulations that are being generated, and they're always going to demand that. So whenever a ministry is coming here and saying, I'm working on a decree that talks about something, we would say, okay, you need to tell us what is the impact. So you need to populate the regulatory impact inform report. So we have the basic sessions that they need to populate. And to tell you a little bit in more detail, this is a platform that is going to be proportional to the impact that is estimated for their new regulation. So everyone does this preliminary evaluation, which is quite simple. But given the answer, and at the end, you can see that there is significant impact and actually relevant impact, we can open new sections and ask the regulator to include more evidence and more detail in what they're saying.
And this platform is available, and all ministries have someone responsible for the platform. And it took us 2 years to really lead this platform to these use and make them see the advantages, and now the users see the tool as a very useful tool, especially because it works for receiving feedback in the interactive process they have. And when they enter the Congress as a law, they already have the work done of the analysis and the evidence to really base and fight for the legislation. So it works as a complementary work to the legislative work. And so it is the same that we use and the reasons why the platform is being used now. And there is a disparity between ministries because we have some that are more technical and evidence-based when launching a regulation, and some that are not so used to performing that kind of analysis. And so when we do the trainings, we went ministry by ministry, and there were some that had 20 participants making notes of the methodologies, and the ones that were like defending themselves, and the authorities of the state and people that were part of the ministry looking at us like, what are they talking about? Are they speaking Chinese? But anyway, today, all of them use it, and it has worked as a way to generate this internal capacity in the ministries to perform that kind of analysis. And here, we know there was an advance with this online platform, and Chile has been recognized internationally about the good work we did, but there is still a lot to do. And so here you have a graph where you can see where we are today. It's just the tip of the iceberg, what we are trying to do now, because we have the projects that come from the executive and also the ones that can have an impact or something that can be updated time to time. And if we consider the projects that come from the executive, it is 15% of all the initiatives that go to the Congress. The rest of them are motions with the congressmen and senators. So we have 85% of the flow that is entering, not going through that kind of analysis. And out of curiosity, in Chile, the time of processing all that is very long. And from what enters, what has been published is really a low percentage. So we see that 67% is published, and the time is shorter in these cases, less than a year, when the other ones have 2 years between messages and motions coming from congressmen and senators. So we hope to have more initiatives from the Congress and from the legislative bodies, because going through this process before entering the project on the Congress helps. And actually, if they don't do it, they're not meeting the goals. And this is my last slide before turning to Fernanda. Let me talk about the flow here a little. When you have a standard stock, we have some advances, and we recognize that in this instance, we are delayed related to the flow of quality control, but we have a flow for simplifying the regulatory process with a law And we have, for instance, information about digitalization of information. It was the first base, the first step for this regulatory simplification. So it was still in the Congress. And then we have the presidential instruction number 4, which created the regulatory impact reports. And there are small things that may cause a big impact. So when you create a new standard, you have to say explicitly what is the reason, because sometimes there are so many standards regulating pretty much the same thing, and sometimes they can complement each other, but what is the main thing, the main topic, the main regulation, subject matter? So there is no space for so many different understandings, because the people that have to comply with it can do it easy, because we have so many effective legislation. So we want to make it clear that every time someone makes a new standard, we want them to specify this article. So what is the standard about? And we can clean this emptiness in interpretation. The other thing is that we have a date for the revision of the impact. So if there's something that we expect to have an impact, we would establish that after 4 years, we have to review it, as internationally does with some other clauses that are. So the regulation is going to be extinct unless it goes through the review and the public consultation. And the other part, the final part here, when we take 5 steps ahead, really, we have a modern tool with artificial intelligence that came from a Canadian company. And they capture all the information in Chile and helped us see the clusters, the groups of standards that were very similar. And we could review them manually and see opportunities of improvement in this aspect. So we could make them into one single text, and what we could do about it, or something that became obsolete and needed updating. So this was a pilot project carried out in 2020, and we hope in the future, with a partnership with the government of Chile, we can carry on doing these things with that kind of tool, because manually reviewing all of that is really difficult. So we have to make use of the technology to simplify our standards and our kind of regulations. And now, Fernanda, you have the floor. Thank you, Camila.
Ahí, ¿me confirman que se ve?
Sí,
Can you
perfecto.
see my screen?
Buenísimo, muchas gracias. Bueno, gracias.
Very well. So thank you, Camila. Thank you all for being here. And continuing with the presentation, I would like to take it to a more practical aspect. So we have a very clear manifest here of the importance of the control of the regulatory quality, not only in Chile, but globally. We know the importance now, and we know how to regulate, when to regulate, and this is a matter that is well known now, but I would like to talk about the size of all that. And we know that in March 2020 in Chile, we had 119 projects entering the Congress. And that talks about those initiatives that comes from the beginning of the pandemic, and it's impossible to evaluate the impact all of those projects may have in the economy or in the society in general. So it ends up being worse than the disease itself in these cases. So when we go through a crisis, we have to react quickly, and it's not possible to use all the tools and take all the steps. And so we have to react and work against the time, really. So we have to implement systems of regulatory impact analysis, because that was the most important at that point. And as Camila mentioned, in that case, sometimes we can't go through so much analysis as we wanted, so we have to establish mechanisms of later evaluation. After the urgency, we can see if the regulation is meeting its objectives and is still applicable in any way. So in this sense, the investment in improvement of the procedures is really important, and having the impact reports, because we can approach adequately the impact the pandemic has caused. So it's important to sign out that during crisis, it's important for the regulation to cover and has some flexibility to the regulation itself, so the regulation can react with agility. And so it's important to use new technologies as well. It's key for governments to embed in their regulatory process different technological mechanisms that we are going to mention later on, in a way that they avoid new crises and new conflicts, and you can act with agility, but also in accordance, so the regulation is effective. So here we see some examples of what may happen, or what are the risks of a bad regulation. First of all, when the regulation is not well regulated, is not well written, it can cause some problems in the activity or a zone, so they will shift to a non-regulated zone. That's something that happens, and it can cause some cases of non-compliance, or the creative compliance, as we call it, when the regulation fixes some loopholes or is excessive broad, and allows the regulating parties to adapt it in a way to evade their compliance. So it's at the end of the day that regulation is not efficient enough, or is not agreeing with the expected goals. Something else that may happen is that sometimes regulations that intend to solve a situation, a specific situation, ends up being counterproductive, and really, instead of decreasing some conduct, it can increase, it can enhance them.
Another thing is that many times we can create some different initiatives. So, for example, when we have certain standards, many times when we establish that from this date, that standard is going to, for example, have a fine, or it's going to establish limitations or a certain type of activity. will get to a specific step, sometimes we see some different incentives so that the regulated will change their structure specifically to be just underneath the standard and therefore avoiding these consequences. They're not going to have this consequence. Finally, as well, there could be cases when we have regulation that will not generate impact on its relationship or its coexistence with other standards in this set. And we could have negative impact as, for example, too much bureaucracy in exchanges or, higher regulatory complexity, etc. Now, what is a main element? And this is something that Camila already mentioned and Renata also mentioned it, which is how to avoid going into these situations that are undesirable where we have bad regulation or failed regulation. Here, the fundamental role is the participation of main players. And when I say players, I mean everyone. So the industry, social society, the citizens, the academy, and any other sector, any other public sector fields, and any players that could be affected or that have an opinion about a regulatory process that is going to take place.
¿Por qué es tan importante la participación
And here, why is it so important to have the participation of all stakeholders? Here, in first place, I would like to say that something that is very important, which is an evidence-based regulation. And why do I say that? Because the regulator, I think we all know, the regulator doesn't have monopoly of experience. And many times the regulator doesn't know or don't have the entire information about the problem. So that's why here it's key that based on the evidence, we can check with different players what is this information so that we can have a regulation that is effective or for the regulation to come to play according to reality. And also to be able to identify problems, we can also generate, the same industry citizens, and they should access this problem. If they see this problem firsthand, they are going to be the ones that can help the most with alternatives to solve the problem. That's why it's key that this information is shared with the regulator when they are at the point of creating new policies. Secondly, it is important to have this participation because through this participation, we can have a global and inclusive focus. Many times the regulator always has, one view or a partial view of the problem. And therefore, they can't consider everyone who will be affected by regulation. And that's why it's important that citizens, social society, the industry will help gather all the possible rooms and who's going to be affected so that this is all incorporated in the regulatory cycle. And that tomorrow regulation won't come to light affecting, for example, a minority group or someone who is not considered in the process. Then it is also key for us to have the participation of all actors, all players for identifying a goal. Many times the regulator can have specific initial diagnosis or on a problem, they can see that that diagnosis is confirmed by the same players that are involved in the process. So for example, here, many times we say that we are designing a regulation or a standard, and we have a initial diagnosis. And after checking with many players, many stakeholders, we can see that maybe that's a partial diagnosis or this diagnosis only works for specific cases and not cases in general. So these are diagnoses that can be correct, they could have been correct years ago, but nowadays they are not as valid. So that's why it's key to generate these instances of participation. In fourth place, it's also key to have this participation as a way of legitimizing the decisions that the regulator is making. It is key, and this is also very important. And, and related to that, when the participation of actors is a real participation, this is going to make it easier and increase the feeling of trust in the regulations that are here from the agencies. So they are part of the regulatory process. Obviously, we're going to increase the trust that we have in the rules or standards because they are part of the decision and they were able to contribute to identifying the diagnosis, or they were able to propose specific solutions. In fifth place as well, this is very much connected with the previous one. When we increase and we have more participation of these players, there is also more compliance. This happens on one side because of what we were saying, because they were involved in the process, but also from their perspective, when they are involved in the regulatory process, they're going to know what these changes are going to be. What are these modifications? These are modifications that can be implemented to the current regulation. And for them, the implementation cost of new regulation is going to be much smaller. And finally, related to the ex post evaluation, this is also a very important consultation. And this means that these players have the tools and they are going to be the first ones, or like the first called, how can I say that, to be able to identify errors in implementation, or if they are not, if there is any type of something that is incoherent that needs to be adjusted. So this is something that has to be in practice implementing, and they're going to be able to really identify these risks and tell them to the regulator. And here, just to give a little bit of magnitude in comparison to the other companies of OCDE, Chile is very strong in the participation of players. We can see here in terms of laws, we're only after Japan and Colombia. And there was advancement from 2018, and the infra-legal standard is also something that we are also growing. We are in the 4th position of countries. So this is a topic that Chile is constantly working with, and we are very developed considering the rest of the countries. And here, how to advance towards an open government. Ooh, sorry. Here we have the scale of participation, or the different levels of participation. And we can say that we go from the most basic to the final one, the bottom one, which is the most complex. So first we have a relationship of information, which is more than information. It's a situation with information where the agencies are going to have information in a transparent way. However, it's not a double way information, because we're only going to get, we're not going to get feedback from the citizens, for example, or from the players. So they're not going to have any influence in the regulation. Then we have kind of a medium level, which is consultation, and that's a step forward, because it's not only transparent and informing about regulatory changes, but in this stage, we are also going to receive some information. However, there isn't any obligation of considering that feedback in the final result. In the final step, we are talking about a true alliance, a true partnership. And here we do have cooperation where there is a partnership effectively, and the opinions of the players are actually considered and they will influence the final decision of the regulator. So obviously, in this participation dynamic, we need to consider some limits as well, which we always have this instance of being most inclusive, and we're always asking, for example, for the opinion or feedback of a specific industry sector. And obviously, we can reproduce several things and maybe not considering certain sectors that can be minoritary. And here are just some examples of tools that should be used in the future. And because of the time, I'm going to go over them quickly, but this is becoming more and more important for us to apply behavioral insights, the behavioral theory, in the regulatory design. And this is from the point of view of the regulator. So the regulator who is creating this regulation, they need to have this view. And also from the point of view of the regulator, the regulated, sorry. So they are answering on the incentives and how they are able to respond according to social standards, who's sending the message, and etc. Then we have digital technologies. Clearly, this is something that is being more and more used in all countries. Artificial intelligence, this is something that Camila already mentioned. We have some artificial intelligence mechanism to analyze the regulatory stock and also the impact of new regulation. And also connected to what I was saying before, the importance of data analysis of the regulation. This is very important, and data analysis is also a fundamental piece of the puzzle. Here I have an example very quickly. This is an example from Canada. In Canada, they implemented through technology in a base of cooperation between the regulator and all stakeholders. They were able to implement this mechanism of amendment regulations to be able to effectively simplify stock and removing obsolete disposition, removing duplication of norms, improving coherence, and several mechanisms to simplify regulations. Here, they wanted to have an analysis of the norm and just simplifying and kind of cleaning the stock that is obsolete or incoherent, or using technology as well as this participation. And finally, to be able to finish, we have lessons learned, recognizing here, and I believe everyone in this panel knows that all changes take time. So it's not just enough to have good intentions. It's necessary to have incentives and also implement some changes of conduct to get out of the status quo. And it's necessary to strengthen institutionality to be able to monitor and promote the application of good regulatory practices. The requirements for good implementation were implemented as well, having support from the high political level and involving other technical parts as well and all players. And also, just to finish the last point, as Fernanda was saying, at the end, this is a task that whoever is in charge of promoting the use of this tool, they need to be consistent in time, they need to be conscious, and they need to also go around the culture of regulators, and it has to be something positive. Because whoever is doing this, when you go towards improving your regulation, there's no turning back. This is something understood as something specific and very important on our role. And this is something that we have that is very important. As Fernanda also said at the end, we need to involve the regulated people more. And this is something that Chile should improve. There are some consultation services, but not in the best way or the most bulk way that we can. And we have the, many different stakeholders. They're the same as always that comment, but we would like to have all stakeholders involved that are participating in this instance, that are committed to the process. And one thing that we can say from the regulator point of view to back that up is to have more regulation information. This is a good regulatory practice that is international. And we say the government, hey, in the next 4 years, I want to do this, this, and this. We can say that each year, especially on the most technical areas that are regulated, the regulator can say, I have these regulations here, and then I can think that they're going to have significant time, and we can give the regulator time to say when they can participate, how long they have, and that way we have a more ordered process.
Presentamos en las distintas
Going
diapositivas.
back to what we presented in the slides before, we can work with what comes from the executive power, but at the end of the day, a huge part of the flow of the regulations come from the Congress. So it is a pending challenge for most of the countries. And the idea is how to establish a good practice in the culture of a country, including the initiatives that come from the Congress. So there is some kind of impact analysis to those regulations as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. And now we go to the Q&A session because the time is running short. So Camila and Maria Fernanda, thank you very much for what you have shared with us. And I would like to start by congratulating Chile for the huge work they have carried out. It can be demotivating or a huge incentive to identify the position Chile is around the other countries. And so it's a huge work. And of course, as you mentioned, there is still a lot to do, and all stakeholders have an important role, which is to play to keep this going. So congratulations. We have some questions here. Camila, the first one is from Fernando Sandoval for Camila, which has to do about what are the key elements a regulatory impact report must have, and should it happen before starting a new regulation? Well, thank you for the question, Fernando. And effectively, we have in the same platform the same system for laws and decrees. And the reach for this process is the same. Exception are some specific points when you have to discuss the public budget, and so the impact would not be an easy task to do. But for all laws, they have to go through and have to have this impact report. And so that's what we do. We have more than naming an authority, generating a change in what is being regulated. And so there is an entrance to the platform. So first of all, you delimit the problem. So you say, okay, I want to regulate because I have identified something's not working. And then you have to mention what is the problem to be solved, what are the goals. So very clearly, you have objectives that can be possible to implement, and not objectives that may happen like the lawmakers sometimes are very idealistic and they want to save the world somehow with this law. And when you see what they articulate, you know with those changes you can't achieve that. So the regulators must have the information and understand the asymmetry information and have objectives that uh, sometimes can be achieved, but to the public in general, it doesn't show that. So you have to consider that when you want to build trust to the institution and the regulation. And then you also have a space for other players to participate, so you can have international cooperation and you can see what happened in other countries, what worked and what didn't work and why it didn't work. And so this is a general panorama of all the alternatives you can use to solve the same problem and consider what would be the most convenient for the country. So you need an implementation plan. And of course, regulations sometimes are not a perfect design, but you need to have an implementation plan, consider the risks, consider how you are going to adjust the regulated parties' behaviors, and in reality, how will the regulated parties will react, how they will act under the law. And so maybe the law or the regulation need to take that in mind and maybe consider something better. So when you consider in reality the regulated party, you can try and consider other approaches. So you can identify key identifiers who can be used to follow up over time, KPIs. So you can evaluate, was the regulation useful or not? Is it meeting its goal or not? And then you can run the ex post evaluation of the standard or the regulation. So from the first step to the last, it is really important to carry out this methodology. And just to complement, some agencies use that for regulatory impact reports. So this report is important for, and it helps a lot in the whole process, because sometimes the agency designs a regulation and at the end, the last requirement for presenting is creating the regulatory impact report to meet just a requirement. But the truth is that when you fill in this step throughout the process, it helps the regulator to go and choose the best alternatives to delimit some objectives. So with that, you can do the work, and at the end, you have a better idea of the regulation. Otherwise, you may not have the same impact, which is one of the main goals of carrying out the analysis. And Sandra, if you allow me to have a final comment.
Hoy en día, claro,
nowadays, before a law gets to the Congress, it's presented with the message and financial reports and all that. If it is a decree, you have to add as complementary information some other aspects, but that happens like that today, but there is a flaw in the publicity of these reports and the access to people. In our web page, we have a section called Regulatory Impact Reports, but what we want is to incentivize it. So we want people to go to the pages of each ministries, because the regulated parties have a relationship with the regulating parties. So You have a session for open public consultation, as well as one about the regulatory impacting reform reports. So it would help a lot for everyone to speak the same language in a way. The general audience, regulated and regulating parties, the Congress, and so everyone can have access to that information. That is very important too. Thank you. And in the same sense, we have a complement in terms of the technical barriers to trade, where you have access and have international visibility, and it generates feedback from the international community as well, right? Thank you both very much. We have Stephen, and he's giving us some of his time so we can answer the other questions. So thank you, Stephen. And we have a question from Zeida Guzman. In Chile, there is an institution related to these regulations. Each ministry has a technical body, like energy or telecommunications. They are in charge of them. But as we said, if we consider a technical barrier to trade, there is a regulation in the Ministry of Economy that has some requirements in terms of notifications, and then you have the coordination. But yes, each regulatory agency intervenes in this process. The next question, I think it has already been answered. For each law, regulation, and standard, do you have to carry out the regulatory impact report? So yes, for every law for general application, you have to do it in all ministries, except, as mentioned by Fernanda, if it's an urgency case and you have to present the project quickly, you can do it without the report, but later on you have to do it, but it's just after. So it means all of the laws have to have them. It's important to emphasize that. Thank you for the precision. And now we have a question from Robson. We'd like to know what areas of the regulation agencies participate in the development of the regulatory impact reform report, like an example is the development of a standard for medical devices. So yes, together with the Ministry of Economy, we have this technical support on how to face the questions in the questionnaire, and sometimes we have to review some quantification of impact, and so we provide help on that, and we have talked to the ministry to help them to normalize all that. But the Ministry of Health, for instance, that have different areas, each area has access to this platform, and so we create a user to each distinct area inside the ministry.
Es que como hay preguntas específicas que
And the good thing is, since we have specific questions and we have the levels of lawyers, secretaries, ministries, we know that they're not going to answer maybe. You are generating, in my opinion, an interaction between the types of office and the types of technicians that are below the ministry, because they're actually going to have to ask for help to evaluate and quantify the impact of the proposal. So this is being proposed inside the health ministry. This is what happens. And also, just to complement, there can be cases of standards where we have more than one ministry involved in a case. I don't know, for example, firm or economy, they can have access to this regulatory impact to, have a comment or to say whatever they want to say. Okay, so we have the last question in the Q&A. I still have other 20 questions, but just so we can have a meeting after, and we have a lot of knowledge. This question is in English, so I'm going to read it so we don't lose the essence. It says, the question is from John Misok.
similar to EU and Asian countries, it seems like having one set of standards is called for.
No existe esa plataforma, efectivamente.
We don't have this platform effectively, actually. We have been fighting so that we can have one platform in the government, in the Chilean government, because these are norms that are currently in the public consultation process because they don't exist. Each ministry, you have to have their own public consultation. And on the other hand, there is only one platform that is centralized for these consultations. And of course, for us, the ideal thing would be for us to be able to have these systems, and we can have that at a region level to share good practices when we have regulation and this impact in commerce, and we can learn from experience. So hopefully we will have that. We will support that, but we're still a step before that at a domestic level. Perfect. Camila, Maria Fernanda, we could stay here forever, but we will invite you to come to another event because it's clear we have a lot to learn, we have a lot to cooperate, and we really appreciate your participation. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to the Ministry of Economy, and thank you for coming on this event. Thank you so much. And now we are going to go to Stephen Bipes, so he can share from the perspective, which is a little bit more global, in his role inside of ADVAMED, specifically about how they are perceiving the role that we have as an industry in the good regulatory practices process. Stephen, please.
Yes.
All right. Good morning to all the presenters and the attendees. And thanks also to Adimetch and Gabriela for the ongoing partnership with the coalition and ADVAMED. We're a member of the coalition and we serve on its executive committee. We work to advance good regulatory practices globally, and the coalition is a key partner in this work in the Americas. We also work regionally with these objectives together with the Inter-American Development Bank and through the Americas Business Dialogue, in which I am one of the co-chairs of the ABD Transparency and Regulatory Cooperation Working Group. There's been a wealth of information shared today from the coalition and open, and I extend my congratulations as well to the ministry and the broader Chilean government for the excellent focus and initiative to implement good regulatory practices in Chile. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to try and keep it short and sweet, but rather I wish to conversationally draw attention back to some key observations and recommendations for the role of the private sector and industry in GRP implementation, as we were just discussing. GRP is, of course, good for general public administration and transparency and economic growth and effective regulation, but critically also for health and the medical technology sector. GRP also means improved patient access to new technologies, but actually saved lives and improved lives. In working with the ADVAMED member companies in engaging with governments across Latin America, it is sometimes easy to think that GRP is a government function. And government certainly has a central role, as was discussed in the previous sessions. But the base of GRP is a life cycle of maintenance that is fed, informed, improved, and to some degree made functional by private sector engagement. GRP can be considered to be a quality management system for the regulatory process, in the same way that it would be unthinkable to have a medical device manufacturing facility or for a company to manufacture and ship a medical device to a hospital or patient without a quality management system. It should likewise be unthinkable to have a technical regulation without a quality management system, and that's the purpose that GRP serves. But a foundational aspect of GRP is the idea that the more eyes and broad review that a draft regulatory idea can have, the more robust and effective that it will be. This means public consultation. And this means the public should be continually looking for and participating in public consultations on draft technical regulations. And as Renata was mentioning earlier, the World Trade Organization notification process can be considered to be a type of mandatory global 60-day comment period on draft technical regulations. If the governments don't notify these draft measures, or if they don't notify properly, or if the regulated parties do not track the notifications or provide comments, then the system does not work. I track and the coalition tracks the notifications that the WTO emits on medical devices, at least those from the Western Hemisphere. And when we see a notified measure that is not consistent with the WTO TBT agreement, particularly when the draft technical regulation is not based on the relevant international standard, we develop a specific trade concern and we submit comments. And we submit comments with what we call casework. What do we mean by casework? I'll give you an example. I'll very frequently get a phone call from a member company saying, there's a new technical regulation in Peru and it's causing problems. And then I kind of have to open my notebook and start a detective case. Like, how is it causing problems? Oh, well, it's overly burdensome. Well, how is it overly burdensome? Oh, well, it's not doing this. And what we're trying to do on the private sector side through the coalition is to really educate and capacity build our member companies and associations to kind of have a standardized checklist of gathering the information that we can then provide to the governments, because we pretty much have in general terms, an open offer, I would say, from the governments of the Western Hemisphere to address regulatory and standards non-alignment when we can bring them the relevant casework. And the casework needs to be a short description or identification of the technical regulation. That's the problem. The reference to the relevant international standard that should be the basis of the technical regulation, a very rough estimate of the health and trade impact of the measure, and a consensus position on what the resolution would be, what regulatory convergence looks like. Because what happens is, if I get a complaint or a request from a member company and I call the US government, say the US trade representative, the first question they'll ask me is, did the government notify the measure? If they didn't notify the measure, well, then it's inconsistent with the TBT agreement and it really needs to be rolled back and undone. If they did notify the measure, then the US government will ask me, did the industry comment? And if the answer is no, then the response from the government is going to be, well, if the private sector didn't take the time to track the notifications or to provide comments, why should it be a priority for us? Because certainly if we don't have the time, they don't have the time, as they are very tight staff and they cover all regulated sectors. So the TBT agreement really is a very nice mechanism. It's a core component of good regulatory practices. It certainly is not the whole breadth of GRP, but it's a core element of it. And it's legally binding in terms of international trade law. And so a strong role and recommendation from AdvaMed, from the coalition for the member companies is to do your part, do our part, be tracking these notifications, use the EPING system for the markets in which you're putting products onto market, be tracking the notifications, supply comments, constructive comments, always tying it back to the relevant international standard that should be used. And also, if you're submitting comments in response to a domestic public consultation, have your comments to the WTO be complementary. And a lot of our work in the coalition is in this regard, educating our members as we continue our collaboration with the government. So it's been a pleasure to be on this panel, and we look forward to the future sessions. Back to you, Sandra.
Muchas gracias, Steven. Verdaderamente short and sweet. Creo que en 2 minutos.
Thank you, Steven.
Thank you, Steven. It's really short and sweet. This is the private initiative for us to collaborate with governments to be able to make sure we're going to have this in development and to have this in its purpose, which is making sure we're going to have products, medical devices in the market that are safe, that are going to make sure we have development, but that will not limit access because of the incorporation of requirements that will not necessarily contribute to make sure we'll have these initial purposes. It's very clear that as an industry, we still have a lot to learn, a lot to import, and we make sure that as Coalition, we are here to help you in developing these competences, to help you in developing these cases when eventually we need to present. But it's also important, like you mentioned, like Steven mentioned, and all the other presenters mentioned as well, our participation is very important, and that will make sure that the processes will happen in a more efficient way in terms of using resources from all sectors, because this is what is going to help detect risks from very early in the process, and it's going to avoid getting to a level of specific trade concern in the World Trade Organization. We can see how quality systems will clearly understand if everyone is clear on the requirements, having the correct processes to comply with them from the first time without having any changes. Because that, at the end of the day, we understand that will help governments, will help the industries, and finally will help patients, which is our reason for being here. With that, we're going to close today's session. We will wait for you tomorrow. Gabriela, please, if you have any comments from ADIMEC, we also want to thank ADIMEC for everything that we've been doing to be able to develop these events. Gabriela? Thank you so much, Sandra. I would just like to thank all panelists from today. I think it was very interesting. Like you said, we had a lot of questions that we had to answer. We're going to, try to answer as many as we can, and we'll wait for you tomorrow. We are going to have a very interesting journey, very intense journey, where we will keep learning, as we already said. We're going to see the need of having good regulatory practices and for everyone's well-being, and we will have to continue moving forward with the build and implementation of all of them. Have a nice day. Thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.